All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're not just looking at a piece of machinery, we are actually tracing the absolute origins of an icon, the Luger. We're going to examine the very first production model ever adopted by a military, tracing a true landmark in semi-automatic pistol development. So let's just jump right in and see exactly where this incredible story begins.
The sheer rarity of what this number represents is just wild. We're talking about serial number 01 of the Swiss model 1900 Luger. Now sure, prototypes and toolroom models existed before this, but the big takeaway you need here is that this specific number marks the absolute first mass-produced military Luger ever made. I mean, it is literally the very first gun from the very first production batch of the very first country to adopt the Luger. It really doesn't get more foundational than that.
Section 1. Serial number 01. The Time Capsule. This pistol features a gorgeous, original deep blue finish. It's basically a time capsule that perfectly preserves original industrial craftsmanship right alongside honest serviceware. You can see it stamped on the toggle with the DWM factory logo. That's the German weapons and ammunition company that produced it. But what's really fascinating is the Swiss cross proof mark on the top of the chamber. Because these guns had to go through an approval process with Swiss authorities, those cross stamps were actually applied after the gun was completely finished. That's why, if you were to look incredibly closely, you would see a slight blistering in the finish right around those specific stamps. It's a tiny detail, but it speaks volumes about the manufacturing process.
Section 2. The Swiss military trials.
So, to understand why this gun even exists in the first place, we have to flash back to the late 1890s, when the Swiss were on the hunt for a new sidearm. Tracking this rapid timeline, the Luger, which was actually developed from the earlier, much clunkier C93 Borchardt pistol, was first presented to the Swiss in September of 1898. By 1899, the Swiss had purchased 20 trial guns for some really extensive field testing. And that testing went so well that by May of 1900, Switzerland formally adopted it. They became the first country in the world to do so. Finally, in May of 1901, the first physical batch arrived.
The crucial point here is exactly how the Luger managed to win that contract. The Swiss used a really rigorous point-based testing system, evaluating things like accuracy, reliability, ease of disassembly, and general handling. Well, the Luger absolutely blew away the competition. It scored a commanding 95 points, while the very next best competitor managed only 79. Even when they held a second trial against a Mannlicher pistol, the Luger just won again. The Swiss knew for sure this was their gun, even if it still needed a few tweaks.
When that first production contract finally arrived from DWM in May 1901, it obviously took a little time to spool up the manufacturing, but that very first delivery consisted of exactly 610 guns. Now, 600 of those were strictly for the military, as the contract stipulated for the first fiscal year. But what about the extra 10? Well, Luger specifically threw in 10 extra guns as gifts for the Swiss Commission members. Hey, a little bit of influence never hurts, right?
Section 3. A legendary provenance.
You know, a gun's history is really only as good as the verifiable hands it's passed through, and serial number 01 has a truly legendary path. Tracing this lineage, the gun was originally issued to a Swiss officer who carried it through his entire career, eventually retiring and taking it home with him. He later sold it to a Dutchman named Henk Visser, an incredibly observant collector who, fun fact, was also once a co-owner of Mauser. Upon Visser's passing, it was purchased by Geoffrey Sturgis. Sturgis literally wrote the definitive 3-volume encyclopedia on the Luger, where this exact gun is heavily documented. Finally, it made its way to Morphy's auctions. So it has only ever been in the hands of people who deeply, deeply understood its historical significance.
But remember when I said this thing wasn't just sitting in a vault? You can physically see its service history right on the metal. There is noticeable wear on the front strap just from being held. But even more fascinating, there is distinctly heavier wear on the right side of the trigger compared to the left. This physical evidence proves the gun was drawn and carried for an entire military career by a right-handed officer. It's just honest, structural proof of a working life.
Now, this explainer wouldn't be complete without highlighting the gold straw bluing. It's a distinctive, very fragile heat treatment applied to small parts like the trigger and levers. This was a real hallmark of the pre-World War I era of industrial gunmaking. Why this matters to you is that this delicate golden finish absolutely does not survive modern refinishing. Seeing it totally intact on serial number 01 is absolute visual proof that the gun retains its original, completely untouched factory condition.
Section 4. Anatomy of the first Luger.
Because it was the very first, the 1900 model had some totally unique physical quirks that were quickly phased out in later years. These early Swiss models featured incredibly distinct parts,
like a narrow grip safety that only covers about half the backstrap and a really narrow trigger, both of which would be widened later. The manual safety switch actually wasn't glued underneath, which was a deliberate design choice to give a quick visual indicator that the safety was active. And perhaps the most uniquely Swiss feature, the wooden magazine base plates included reflective metal discs. Semi-automatics were brand new technology at the time, and the Swiss wanted a foolproof, highly visible way to check if a magazine was actually seated in the gun.
When you look at the magazine buttons, the evolution is pretty clear. The original iteration on serial number 01 used a very flat button to help you pull down the follower and load rounds. But soldiers quickly realized this flat button was way too hard to grip against that strong internal recoil spring. This prompted later designs to feature taller buttons, which then actually required cutouts in the metal frame of the gun just to make them fit. Serial number 01, however, still has the original flat buttons and a perfectly smooth, uncut frame.
Section 5. Evolution of a classic.
This quote captures a core truth of innovation. Making thousands of units and putting them into the hands of actual soldiers is literally the only way to recognize what needs changing. Engineering is rarely perfect on the very first try. True perfection only comes after rigorous real-world stress testing using real field exercises. The 1900 Luger was a masterpiece, sure, but it was just the beginning of iterative design.
By the time Switzerland actually received their initial 2,000 guns, DWM had already sold over 8,000 additional units on the commercial market and to other countries for testing. All that massive feedback poured in and resulted in the 1906 new model. The new model retroactively turned the 1900 into the old model, transitioning to flat checkered toggles instead of the smooth, dished ones. And most importantly, it replaced those older V-springs with far more reliable coil springs, a real game changer. Because of these rapid, highly beneficial mechanical advancements, almost all other nations that eventually adopted the Luger just went straight for the 1906 new model. In fact, only Bulgaria adopted the original 1900 pattern after Switzerland, buying just 1,000 guns in 1903. This rapid obsolescence is exactly what makes this original, unchanged Swiss 1900 such an incredibly rare survivor. Most of them were either heavily upgraded or just lost to time. So I'll leave you with this thought. Innovation always requires a proving ground. Without the Swiss military taking that very first leap of faith, investing in those trials and fielding those initial 610 units, DWM might never have gathered the data they needed to perfect the design. Serial number 01 isn't just some rare collectible. It is the absolute physical proof of that very first necessary step toward creating a mechanical legend. Thank you for joining me, and keep questioning the history behind the engineering.